Hello, it's Maria Toplova, and today I'm going to be showing you three different projects using a variety of watercolor techniques. So the first one is going to be a simple rose, and when drawing a rose, in my mind, is basically just a bunch of crescent moon shapes, but you make them a little bit more wiggly and distorted because nothing in nature is completely perfect, so they'll have like round or rough edges. And then I take a really big watercolor brush, I put a lot of water on it and a little bit of pigment, and then I cover the entire area with it. With watercolor, you always want to keep in mind what your lightest and darkest points of it are going to be. So I'm going to paint everything in a really light coat first. And my lightest points are going to stay the color of that very first coat, so I'm not going to paint anything over the light point. While everything is still really wet, I'm going to put a little bit more pigment on my brush and add it to the places that have all the shadows, and this will cause it all to blend together but still have some more definition. Watercolor will pretty much always dry out a little bit lighter and more dull than what it immediately looks like, so for those really dark or vibrant areas, you need to add a lot of pigment to it. So I have my lightest parts painted as well as some soft shadows that I'll blend together. So I'm going to wait for that to completely dry before adding even more darkness to the edges of the petals. And if I want the edges of these shadows to be a little bit more smooth, I'm going to use some clear water and just pat it down on the edges of that shadow so it blends out a little bit. What's really special and unique about watercolor is that it has a certain freshness to it, meaning the less you touch it and the more you let the water just kind of do its thing, the more energetic and lively your painting is going to look. But since you don't want to touch the same area too many times, you have to be really careful with how you initially place the colors and how you let them blend out. And watercolor brushes can also be used to make really thick or thin lines. So where I want the shadows to be really big and soft, I add a little bit more water and press down on the brush more. But for these places where I want them to be really thin, I just use the very tip of my brush. But you can also erase or lighten your mistakes. Like I wanted the edge of the petal to be lighter, so I took a clean brush and made it wet and then just wiped off some of that paint. So now that that layer of shadows is all dry, I'm going to go into the really dark parts of the rose and add even more pigment. A lot of watercolor is just adding layers to parts that are darker and leaving the white and really light parts with as little paint as possible. So for the leaves, I'm going to be using the shape of the brush to my advantage, and since it comes to a point, I'm just dotting the edge of the leaf, as you can see there, and then later I'm going to fill it in. I'm keeping the paint really wet so that's easy to blend these like darker shadows smoothly. I do the same for the second leaf, and when that's all dry, I go in with a smaller brush and add those little details. So my second watercolor piece is going to be a different kind of flower, but a little bit more complicated. This one is called a Stargazer. Remember to keep your pencil marks really light or erase them before you paint because watercolor is really thin. So to start off, I'm putting clear water on all the places about to paint on because I want a lot of pigment in the center and then I want it to bleed out and blend into the white. But for the places that I want to keep absolutely white, I'm not going to be putting any water or pigment there. So I mix this purplish color and I'm just packing as much pigment as I can in the center. I'm dabbing it on and not really like brushing it out because I want it to blend naturally with the water. And I'm doing the same thing on the rest of the petals, but I'm not touching the very edges of the petals because I want those to stay white and I'm trying to separate them. I feel like for painting like these, it's the best idea to just let the watercolor do its own thing and blend out how water normally does. And you can kind of direct it where you want it to go, but you should leave the blending just up to the water and up to the paint. And also make sure to frequently change the water that you're using to wash your brush because whatever color is in that water will end up being on your painting. So make sure to clean it out all the time if you want to have the colors that you actually want. And you can see for a couple of the petals that the very center is white. So in order to keep those white, I'm not going to be putting any water or paint there, so that just only the color of the paper comes through. And if you feel like you have too much water or too much paint in a certain place, you can just use a dry brush to soak it up. And for these edges, I'm going to clean up some of it by taking a very clean brush, making it wet, and just wiping off the extra paint. It's a good idea to have an extra brush set aside just for cleaning up these little mistakes, but honestly, the best thing to do would be to just leave those white and like untouched with paint, but mistakes happen and it's fine to clean it up. And you might have to go over the same area a few times to clean up that paint. And now I'm going over those edges again using a clean wet brush. So after that first layer of really wet paint is completely dry, I'm going back with really pigmented paint to add shadows and details. So I left that center part of the flower completely white because it's a really light green, and if I painted over it with any of that purple color, then I wouldn't be able to get that light green. You want to be careful to paint around stuff like that. And this flower also has these dots on all of its petals, so I'm only doing it when everything under it is completely dry so it doesn't blend out. And now I'm painting that center part. I'm adding a little bit more detail again when the bottom is completely dry so that it doesn't blend in with everything around it. And this isn't super necessary, but I'm adding a little bit of shadow on the edges of the petals that are white, so the shadow is a light blue. And I'm painting the stem and leaf, but I'm starting with a really light coat, and then I'm going back with a darker one so I can paint the actual color of it. And I did that so I could have those really light green lines come through, but it only worked because I waited for the bottom to dry completely before adding the dark part. And now finally I'm adding the shadow under the stem only when the light part has completely dried. Okay, so for the third project, I'm painting a blue jay. This one's pretty simple. Since most of it is white, I'm gonna be leaving those white parts untouched, but I'm gonna be starting with the blue wings and tail feathers, and I'm just packing a lot of water and a lot of pigment, and I'm using some clear water to blend that out for where it's lighter. And the tail has really light feathers on it, so I'm starting with a really light layer of color. But the wing also has some white feathers on it, so I'm being really careful not to paint over that one stripe of white so I can keep those white feathers. And now before it's all completely dried out, I'm adding a little bit more pigment in certain areas so they're darker and more vibrant. And it also blends out smoothly. But on the tail, I don't want the dark feathers to blend out, so I'm waiting until it dries completely before I add them in. A good rule of thumb is that you use wet on wet color if you want it to blend out, and if you want those crisp edges, you do it in layers with flat colors. So now that I added those details on the tail with a thin brush, I'm waiting until everything dries completely before going in with black details. And I have a lot of pigment on my brush, so the black is really dark, and I only do it when everything is dry. And I still want my bird to look 3D, so I'm adding some light gray shadows onto the white part. I have a lot of water and a little bit of black pigment so that it turns out really light, and I can also blend it out by adding more clear water. And there you go. Now it's your turn.